So I went to confession today, as I usually do on Sundays, and I was reflecting for the past couple of days on the importance of confession, and especially on its social utility instead of just its moral benefit. And in thinking a lot more about it, it's increasingly clear just how important confession is. And so first and foremost, it presupposes an objective morality. So in confession, we're forced to return to the source of morality and recognize its authority and its legitimacy. And this keeps us properly oriented. The second benefit is that it forces humility. That is to say that it forces an honest look. It forces us to honestly look long and hard at ourselves against this moral law. It requires that we take a comprehensive and an exhaustive inventory of basically our moral state of things. And this, I think, is incredibly important, that both of those conditions are required, comprehensive and exhaustive. That is to say, you have to look at every facet of yourself and not just look at it, but really dig all the way to the bottom to see if you are truly behaving morally. And both of those elements are required for a proper confession and for true forgiveness. And this, I think, is so incredibly important because, especially obviously with moral relativism, or even with just moral objectivism, the way in which we interact with it, it's so easy to ignore the vices in our lives, whether it's the big ones or it's the small ones. But no, confession demands that I recognize even the smallest of sins, because even the smallest of sins, even the smallest of vices, is inherently malignant. And then the third thing is that it separates us from our sins. And I think this is incredibly important to recognize, and something that often goes unrecognized today, especially given how ubiquitous and long-standing Christianity has been. But recognize that forgiveness allows a distinction between the individual and the sin itself. If we just theoretically entertain an absence of forgiveness, if there was no such thing as forgiveness, then you become inextricably tied to your sin. If you murder someone, if you lie, if you cheat, you steal, you become those things fundamentally, inextricably, unalterably. The fourth thing is that it sets us on the path to recovery. When we confess things, like obviously, well, in order to recover from anything, whether it's alcoholism or a general sickness or anything, you obviously first have to admit that you're sick. And by confronting the moral law and yourself against it, you're forced to admit your shortcomings. You're forced to admit your sickness. But then in admitting that, you then have the first step toward recovery. You now have a map toward how to actually improve and how to actually progress. And then the fifth thing is that it makes you empathetic toward others who sin. We all recognize in confessing that, wow, I really am not perfect. And then we see the other people in the confession, we realize that they're not perfect. And then we extrapolate this to others and realize, wow, we really are in a fallen world and that there is no one who's perfect. And what this does is that it creates a shared humanity. It creates a shared experience between everyone. Even if you've never met them before, you can love people that you've never even met because you understand them, because you share an element of life with them. And I think what this does is it breeds humility, it breeds love, it breeds empathy in a way that if you don't have to recognize your own sin, that would only engender, I think, pride and egoism and ultimately contempt and hatred for those who are the sinners, which we'll get to in here in a second, I think is the current state of affairs in politics, is especially you see the left is incredibly vitriolic toward the right, condemning them as people instead of not just as purveyors of bad policy, but of people who are fundamentally sick, racist, hateful, evil. Is it any wonder that they think this? Because they can't separate the individual from the sin. Yeah, and they themselves never really have to confront their own shortcomings because a lot of them, and this is obviously painting with broad strokes, but a lot of them never have to paint with, none of them really have to admit their own shortcomings, their own failings. And so why would they empathize with someone else? They themselves are, according to their own standards, perfect. So if you're a demigod, why would you ever associate with a subspecies? And then so by inverting the above benefits, we can actually come to see their social costs. And so the inverse of presupposing an objective morality is that we tacitly accept moral relativism by default. And so without being forced to acknowledge an objective moral standard, we necessarily come to define morality by ourselves. And in our moral relativism, there's clearly no way to actually progress because progression necessitates that you have an unchanging set of standards against which you can actually move forward. We treat morality as arbitrary and as random, and then we wonder why we can't align politically. Well, every political issue is the manifestation of a moral principle, so however could we? Furthermore, is that if you reject confession and all of the social and moral elements that are contained in it, it allows pride to grow unabated. In never really having to look outward, we inevitably turn inward for all of our answers. And so we become to ourselves our own God. That is to say, we self-deified and we view ourselves as perfect. And as we'll get into this later, how could that do anything but ever engender resentment and contempt toward those who are not perfect? That is to say, those who don't conform to our own moral standards. But that's the ridiculousness of it, is in recognizing the equal validity between all moral systems, you remove from yourself the ability to judge anyone else. So how could you ever really grow contemptuous? Because you have to admit that your own morality is not better than others. Yet, of course, that's what we see. This is one of the glaring contradictions. The third thing is that it makes us our sin. Again, I think we fail to recognize how beautiful is the fact that forgiveness separates us from our sins, is that without forgiveness, we are our sins. But in forgiveness, we can separate the sin from the sinner. And that's why Christ can admonish us to love our enemies, because he can recognize the difference between the individual and their sin. Like, if we were our sins, then Christ really would have no power on the cross, because there would be no way to save us, because we are our sins otherwise. But because we are not our sins, Christ can forgive our sins by his act. The fourth thing is that it allows us to ignore reality and our sickness. Obviously, if we never have to confront an objective moral standard, we can always go on thinking that we're great. It's like, filling in random answers on a Scantron and then never actually having to get it graded. Well, of course, you can always think that you're right, because you never actually have to admit that you're wrong. And I think this is actually incredibly dangerous, especially morally, whenever you talk about trying to build a virtuous society. Well, you can only build a virtuous society if you have virtuous individuals. But if those individuals never actually have to confront the fact that they're failing, well, then how can you ever hope to attain a virtuous society? It's so self-defeating. It's incredible. And then the fifth thing is that it makes us hate one another. In having no standard to tell you when you've gone astray, as I mentioned earlier, you naturally come to think of yourself as perfect, which will always engender resentment toward others who are not perfect, unless you have this model of Christ, who, though he was perfect, still loved and still forgave. And so in not recognizing the shared humanity you have with other people, it naturally becomes almost impossible to empathize, and in that, almost impossible to actually love one another. And so I think this is really one of the biggest advantages that Christians have over non-Christians, or that the religious have over the secularists, is that there's an actual system of accountability, that there's a method to actually improve yourself and an objective standard. There's no such method in secularism. With this accountability, Christianity makes better citizens of its members than does the heathen world. And again, you can only ever have a virtuous society if you have virtuous citizens, and it's absurd and nonsensical to think that we could ever create a just society with unjust persons. But obviously the only way to create just persons is to have a shared morality. On the whole, confession is the culmination of so many beautiful elements of morality and of philosophy and of politics that, when admitted and participated in, really does lend towards social cohesion and moral individual improvement, and then collectively social improvement.